I had been on the road for months by then, my bicycle loaded down with everything I needed to live day after day, night after night, without a real home base. I had gotten used to the rhythm of it: wake up with the sun, pack up the tent, load everything back on the bike, and just keep riding. Every day was about forward progress. I never knew where I'd sleep until I stopped, and most of the time that suited me fine. It was late fall in southern Washington when this happened. I didn't have much of a plan that day. No museums, no sightseeing stops, no friends to visit. Just a day to ride and chip away at the long road ahead. By mid-morning, I rolled into a small town. The smell of fried food drifted through the streets, and for the first time in weeks, I had a craving for something different from my usual trail mix and oatmeal. I spotted a Burger King and decided that would be my lunch. That was unusual for me. I had been a vegetarian for most of my life, but Burger King had just started offering a veggie burger I'd heard about, and it felt like the right time to try it. I ordered one, sat in a corner booth with my panniers piled awkwardly beside me, and ate slowly while sipping on a fountain drink. It tasted fine, better than I expected, and for a brief moment I was just another customer passing through town. Back on the bike, the first few miles were smooth, but not long after, my stomach began to churn. First, I brushed it off. I'd eaten stranger combinations on the road before, sometimes mixing peanut butter with instant noodles if I was desperate, and my body usually handled it. This felt different, though. By mid-afternoon, the unease was steady, a dull ache low in my gut that only got worse as the hours wore on. Still, I pushed forward. I wanted to cover miles, and I told myself I'd feel better once I stopped to rest. An hour before dark, I began searching for a place to camp. I didn't like paying for campgrounds if I could avoid it. Part of the adventure was finding some hidden patch of woods to disappear into for the night. That evening, I found one quickly. A quiet spot shielded by thick trees where I could set up without worrying about being noticed. I pitched my tent while the sky still held the last of the light. Normally, after a long day, I'd tear into food like I hadn't eaten in days. My appetite was bottomless from burning thousands of calories daily. But that night, I barely touched the snacks I had left. I just sat in my tent, scribbling in my journal, trying to plan my route into Portland. The thought of food turned my stomach. When the light outside finally faded to nothing, I put the journal away and tried to settle in. But sleep didn't come easy. I tossed and turned, the ache in my stomach tightening into waves of nausea. A few times I sat up, hand gripping the tent zipper, ready to lean out if I had to vomit. The feeling would ease just enough for me to lie down again, only to return stronger minutes later. A little past midnight, I couldn't fight it anymore. I unzipped the door and stuck my head out just in time, vomiting onto the ground right beside the tent. My whole body shook as I retched, the sour taste burning my throat. When it finally stopped, I rinsed my mouth with some of my precious water and spat it out before drinking the rest to rehydrate. For a while, I felt a strange calm, as though purging had brought relief. I laid back down and finally dozed off. That didn't last long. Around 2:30 in the morning, I woke with the same awful nausea. Came in waves, worse each time, forcing me upright again and again. By 3 o'clock, I was vomiting a second time, weaker now, but relieved to have gotten it out. I repeated the same routine: rinse, sip water, collapse back onto my sleeping bag. By 4:30, the nausea returned, but I didn't vomit. Instead, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent, feeling wrung out and miserable. The hours crawled until the first faint glow of dawn seeped through the fabric walls. As the world outside grew lighter, I opened my phone to check maps and weather. I couldn't ride all the way to Portland like this. 90 miles felt impossible. I found a town 30 miles away with a cheap motel and made that my goal. But right as I began packing my gear, I heard the patter of rain on the tent. It was light, but it made everything feel heavier. I didn't want to break camp in a downpour, so I stuffed my sleeping bag, packed my clothes, and waited. After about 20 minutes, the rain eased, and I seized my chance. I dragged my gear out, loaded the bike, and started pushing it back toward the road. I only made it a few steps before realizing something was wrong. The bike felt sluggish, uneven. I stopped, flipped it over, and found the rear tire completely flat. My heart sank. Fixing flats was second nature to me by then, but in my exhausted state, the task felt monumental. I unloaded the panniers, flipped the frame onto the handlebars and seat, and peeled off the tire. My hands were clumsy, my stomach still queasy, and it took forever to find the tiny shard of glass embedded in the rubber. By the time I patched everything up and reloaded the bike, the rain had returned, harder this time. I pulled on my jacket, turned on my lights, and pedaled into the gray morning. The cold rain soaked through quickly, and I shivered as I rode. Hunger gnawed at me, but I was afraid to eat too much and upset my stomach again. I had run out of water during the night, so dehydration joined the misery. That ride was one of the lowest points of my entire trip. I had fought through brutal headwinds in South Dakota, snowstorms in Montana, and endless climbs in Wyoming, but this day felt worse. Each pedal stroke dragged. I cried more than once, overwhelmed by the misery of it all. The sickness, the rain, the loneliness. Eventually, I reached the small town. I staggered into a grocery store and grabbed what I thought my stomach could handle. Applesauce cups, bland crackers, and ginger ale. I ate some right there in the parking lot, rain dripping from my jacket as I leaned against the bike. Then I pushed the last mile to the motel. It wasn't even noon yet, well before check-in, but the receptionist must have seen how sick I looked. Without hesitation, they handed me a key. The room felt like heaven. I stripped off my wet clothes, took a long, hot shower, and collapsed into the bed. Before I passed out, I managed a quick post on Facebook to let everyone know I was safe. Then I slept for 13 straight hours. The next day, I woke feeling lighter. Not perfect, but alive again. I ate a small breakfast and got back on the bike. 60 miles stood between me and Portland. It was a tough ride in my condition, but I made it by evening and checked into a hostel. That night, I didn't do much, just settled in, stretched out, and let the relief of being there wash over me. Over the next few days, the sickness lingered. I tried to push myself, even went to a museum one day, but the ache returned, slowing me down. Another day I stayed in, watching the impeachment hearings on TV while making trips back and forth to the bathroom. It was a humbling reminder that even on the road, even in the middle of what felt like the adventure of a lifetime, my body could still betray me. But by the third morning in Portland, I finally felt like myself again. Breakfast stayed down, my energy returned, and I walked the city without fear of the sickness clawing back. After days of weakness, I was whole again. It wasn't a ghost story. No monsters in the woods, no strange encounters. Just me, my body breaking down, and the fight to keep moving forward. Looking back, it's one of the hardest stretches of the entire 7 months. Not because of the weather, the terrain, or the bike, but because I had to battle myself mile after miserable mile. And in its own way, that was scarier than anything else. When I finally pedaled out of Portland, stomach settled and legs strong again, I knew I had pushed through one of the darkest parts of the trip. The road was still long, but I was ready to keep going. And that, more than anything, felt like victory. I had been to that stretch of hills and timber before. A couple years back, I had spent some days there, moving through the draws, ridges, and heavy woods, so I thought I knew the place well enough. It was remote, quiet, and not the sort of place you ran into anyone else unless they had business out there. That was part of why I liked it. This time, I decided to go in pre-dawn to make the most of the day. I parked my truck on the far side of a long hill, shouldered my pack, and started walking in the dark. No moonlight reached down through the canopy, and the clouds kept the stars hidden. The beam of my headlamp cut through the blackness, but it didn't do much against the thickets and uneven ground. I found myself stumbling more than I expected, tripping on roots, catching my boot on rocks, crashing into saplings I hadn't seen until I was already in them. The place that had seemed so familiar to me in daylight was foreign in the dark. Every few steps I had to stop, reorient myself, and keep pushing. The effort wore on me faster than I had imagined. After a while, I realized I was unusually tired. Not just a normal tired from hiking in before sunrise, but a heavy, sinking kind of weakness that made me feel off balance and strange. My legs didn't want to respond the way I told them to. My arms felt heavier than they should, as though carrying half the weight of the woods. My head swam, my chest ached faintly, and even my thoughts came sluggish. It was an odd feeling, like my body wasn't quite working with me. I slowed my pace and tried to shake it off, but the feeling lingered. I thought maybe I hadn't eaten enough or had pushed too hard too soon. Either way, it was clear I wasn't going to cover the ground I had planned. I decided to cut the day short and head back earlier than I wanted. Instead of retracing my steps, I figured I'd take a direct route up and over the big hill where I had parked. I had crossed that ridge before, and in my head it was a simple climb up and over. I'd be back at my truck around sundown, maybe a little tired, but no worse for the wear. When I finally reached the base of that hill, though, I stopped dead. What had once been solid timber was now a stripped mess. The whole hillside had been cut. The trees were gone, replaced by a tangle of fallen pulpwood, limbs, stumps, and rough churned dirt. It didn't even look like the same place. The landscape I remembered, quiet woods with tall trunks and a shaded climb, was gone. In its place was a raw scar, a maze of twisted logs and brush piles. The slope was broken and uneven, hard to read, and every step was a gamble. I thought about going around, but daylight was running short. I didn't know what the other side looked like if I skirted around the cut, and I didn't want to risk ending up farther away. So I started climbing. It was miserable. Every few feet I had to change direction. A log blocked my way, so I zigged left. Then a wall of tangled limbs forced me right. Every turn cost energy, and I was already running on empty. My boots slipped on loose bark and wet dirt. My knees buckled when I dropped down off a log, and more than once I had to crawl on hands and knees to push through. The mess was endless. I think I was near the top, then find another stretch of broken timber waiting. The hill seemed taller than it ever had before. The weakness in my body grew heavier with every step. My vision blurred at times. My breathing came shallow and fast. I stopped often, hands braced on my knees, head hanging, heart pounding like I had just run a race even though I was moving at a crawl. I told myself just keep moving one section at a time, but the zigzagging wore me down and the slope gave no easy path. I lost all sense of time climbing through that stripped land. By the time I crested the ridge, the sun was already gone. The woods beyond were in shadow, and night closed in quick. I still had to pick my way down the far side, and the ground there was no better. Chopped, tangled, uneven. Every step felt like a gamble. My legs shook, my head swam, and I slipped more than once. I stumbled into brush, bark tore at my arms, and my boots slid on mud. It was all I could do to keep my footing. When I finally saw the faint line of the road through the trees, I nearly dropped in relief. My truck sat there like a lifeline, the only solid thing in the dark. I climbed in, collapsed against the seat, and just sat there a long time, chest heaving, too spent to even turn the key. My clothes were damp with sweat, my muscles trembled, and my head felt like it was stuffed with cotton. I forced myself to drive, though I don't remember much of the road. The headlights cut through the blackness, but my eyes kept fighting to close. I had to slap my face a few times just to keep alert enough to make the hour drive to my in-laws' house. By the time I rolled into their driveway, I was finished. I went inside, barely said a word, and collapsed into bed. The next day, I couldn't move. My whole body felt drained. It wasn't just sore muscles, it was something deeper, like my system had shut down. I stayed in bed the entire day, barely able to get up for water. Even the following day, I could only move slowly, every step feeling like I'd been sick for weeks. Later, I learned what had been happening. That hike, that fight through the stripped hillside, that bone-deep exhaustion. It wasn't just me being out of shape or having a bad day. It was the first attack of diabetes, the onset that hit me out there in the middle of nowhere. The weakness, the dizziness, the strange off-balance feeling. It was my body giving out on me in a way I hadn't understood. I had pushed through it without knowing what was wrong, not realizing how dangerous it could have been. Looking back, I think about how lucky I was to make it out. Nobody knew exactly where I was. People knew the general area I'd gone to, but not the exact trails or the routes I'd chosen. If I had gone down out there, if I hadn't been able to drag myself back over that stripped hill and to my truck, it might have been days before anyone found me. At the time, it felt like just another rough hike. But later, with the diagnosis clear, I understood that I had been fighting something much bigger than a bad stretch of ground. My body had been in the middle of a storm, and I had stumbled my way out by sheer stubbornness. That stripped hill, that endless maze of logs and stumps, had nearly been more than I could handle. Even now, years later, I can still picture the way the place looked when I reached the base of the hill. The shock of seeing the land I thought I knew turned into that twisted wreck. The way the climb stretched on, the way the daylight slipped away before I ever reached the top. The endless zigzagging, the fight just to stay upright, the relief when the truck finally came into view, and the way my body gave out after, as though it had been holding together just long enough to get me back to safety before it collapsed. That day was the line between before and after. Before, I thought I was just tired, just having an off day. After, I knew my body had been warning me, breaking down in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. It changed the way I looked at myself, the way I planned, the way I prepared. But above all, it made me realize just how close I had come to not making it back at all. I didn't know what I was doing. That's the truth of it. I was young, too eager to get out into the mountains, too proud to admit I didn't know much about gear or how to use it. I thought I was prepared because I had bought what I thought was the right equipment. I had this brand new down mummy bag, one that claimed to be rated to -10 degrees. It looked technical, expensive, professional. Just having it made me feel like I belonged out there with the people who really knew what they were doing. But owning the gear and knowing how to use it are two different things, and that night I learned it the hard way. The bag came out of the stuffed sack stiff, all compressed from being jammed tight for who knows how long. I slid into it without shaking the feathers loose, not realizing that was what gave it the loft and the insulation. I didn't cinch the top around my head either. I left it loose, open just a little, because I thought it would be more comfortable that way. I thought the small opening I left would make breathing easier, not knowing that little hole was going to act like a chimney, pulling every bit of warm air out into the night. The temperature dropped as soon as the sun went down. It was early spring, the kind of weather where the days feel warmer than they really are and the nights turn sharp and biting the second the light fades. I laid there in the bag, waiting for the warmth to build up, but it never did. At first, it was just uncomfortable, like trying to sleep under a blanket that wasn't quite enough. But after a few hours, it went past discomfort. I shivered so hard my teeth clicked. I curled myself up into a ball, tucking my knees to my chest, but the cold pressed through anyway, steady and relentless. I remember the way it settled into me, slow, creeping, like water soaking through fabric. My hands and feet went first, then my legs. My breath felt cold in my chest, every inhale burning in the back of my throat. I couldn't stop shaking. My mind went strange, detached, like I was watching myself freeze instead of living it. There was no way to get warm. The bag wasn't working the way it was supposed to. I didn't even know it was my own mistake that had made it useless. By the time morning came, I wasn't just cold. I was on the edge of something dangerous. My fingers were numb and clumsy. I struggled to get the zipper open, my hands barely obeying me. Sitting up, I felt dizzy, weak, like my head was wrapped in cotton. I didn't understand it at the time, but I know now it was mild hypothermia. If the temperature had been any lower, or if I hadn't had the thin morning light to push me forward, I might have been in real trouble. I forced myself to move. I got a pot of water boiling on the little camp stove, fumbling with the lighter like I had mittens on even though I didn't. When the oatmeal was finally warm in my hands, the steam rising into my face, I felt life creep back into me. Each spoonful helped. The sun edged its way up over the treeline, painting the frost-slicked ground in weak gold. I sat there with the heat of the pot pressed against my palms, shoving food down more as fuel than anything else. Slowly, I came back to myself. By the time we were packed up and back on the trail, I thought the worst was over. I was shaky, but the sun was out and my body was warming. I kept my head down, focused on each step, trying not to think about how close I'd come to getting into real trouble. Then it happened. At first it felt like a shift of weight, something sliding across my shoulders. Then, without warning, the entire pack flopped backward off me. 1 second it was on my back, heavy and steady. The next it was hanging behind me like a dead weight tied only by the waist strap. I nearly pitched forward from the sudden change. I spun around to see the whole thing lying there on the trail like it had tried to escape me. The straps had come completely free, as if the stitching had given way all at once. It was the strangest feeling, like betrayal. My pack was supposed to be the one solid thing, the one piece of equipment I could rely on. Instead, it had just given up, leaving me to drag it like a sled behind me. I stared at it for a long moment, confused and a little stunned. I couldn't figure out how it had even happened. The webbing looked frayed, the ends loose where they had been sewn in. Maybe it had been wearing out for a while, unraveling stitch by stitch until the last thread gave. Or maybe I had packed it wrong, thrown the balance off so much that the stress just tore it apart. I had no choice but to wrestle it back into some kind of order. The group I was with kept moving, and I didn't want to be left behind. I hoisted it up, awkward and unbalanced, and looped the waist strap tighter, cinching it so it dragged behind me. It felt ridiculous, hauling the bulk of it that way, but it was all I could do. Each step down the trail I could feel the sway and pull against my hips. The straps dangled useless, the fabric torn at the seams. Every time I shifted my shoulders, I thought about how easily something small can turn into something serious. A sleeping bag used wrong becomes a frozen night. A pack failure becomes a burden that could slow you down for miles. Out there, nothing really forgives mistakes. The forest doesn't care if you're new, if you don't know better, if you're just trying to learn. Teaches in the hardest ways. That trip stuck with me. I was small then, smaller than the pack itself in some ways. I thought I was strong enough to carry it, tough enough to handle the cold, smart enough to figure things out as I went. But the truth was I wasn't. Not yet. Those nights and mornings carved lessons into me deeper than anything else could. The first time I backpacked, I had already ended up with hypothermia because we'd taken the wrong trail and gone far longer than we'd planned. I'd sweated through my clothes, then crashed in a patch of moss to rest, only to wake up with the cold cutting into me. You'd think that would have been enough warning. But it took this trip, this freezing night in a bag I didn't understand, this pack tearing itself apart under me, for the lesson to sink in. I learned that being unprepared doesn't just make things uncomfortable. It can tilt you toward real danger before you even realize it's happening. I learned that gear isn't magic. You have to know how to use it, how to trust it, how to check it before you rely on it. And I learned that sometimes the worst moments, the ones that leave you shaking and tired and embarrassed, are the ones that end up shaping you the most. By the time we got back to the trailhead, I was exhausted. My hips ached from dragging the ruined pack, my legs were heavy, and my skin still felt chilled no matter how high the sun climbed. But I was safe. I had made it out, and I knew I wasn't going to forget what had happened. That night, lying in a real bed again, I thought back on how close I had come to letting the cold win. It was humbling, sobering. I promised myself I would learn more before I went out again, that I wouldn't just trust the gear to save me, that I'd prepare the right way. Those early trips didn't break me, even though they easily could have. They toughened me, made me cautious, made me respect the trail in a way I never had before. And that's the truth of it. I didn't walk away from those nights with glory or stories of adventure. I walked away with the memory of being cold, of being humbled, of learning that nature has no patience for ignorance. It wasn't fun. It wasn't exciting. It was painful and exhausting, but it was real, and it made me better. I hiked a lot of long trails in my life, parts of the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail too, and I have too many crazy stories to count. Some things that happened were the kind of experiences that only make sense to other thru-hikers, but some moments stuck with me in ways that I can never forget. On the Appalachian Trail, somewhere in Virginia, maybe around Glasgow, I camped at a site that looked normal enough when I first set up. It was one of those small flat clearings with a few fire pits dug into the ground from people who had stayed before. I set my tent back away from the pit, in a spot with a little cover. I thought it was going to be a quiet night, just another stop on the trail. But later, two homeless men wandered in. They looked rough, older, with weather-beaten faces and clothes that looked like they had not been washed in months. They carried bottles with them and before long had a fire going and were drinking heavily. At first I thought nothing of it. I had camped near strangers dozens of times. But something about these two was different. They were not hikers. Their packs were nothing more than garbage bags tied up with twine, and they didn't carry the kind of gear anyone would bring for a real hike. They sat by the fire and started talking, louder and louder as they drank. I was sitting off a ways, just trying to stay quiet, but they noticed me. They kept asking me how old I was, over and over again, like they had forgotten I had already answered. Their words slurred, their eyes glassy, but there was something sharp and mean underneath their drunk laughter. After a while, their talk turned darker. They started laughing about violence, about how they would kill someone if they had to. One of them said something about setting a dog on fire once, and they laughed at the memory like it was a joke. The sound of it made my stomach twist. I sat frozen in my spot, not saying a word, just listening, my whole body tense. I knew if I packed up and left, it would draw attention to me, and I had nowhere to go in the dark. I felt trapped between staying put and keeping quiet or risking whatever reaction they'd have if I moved. That night, the only thing that gave me some relief was the fact that two big guys from the army also camped there. They had arrived just before dark, both strong and confident in a way that made me feel safer. They set up their tents not far from mine, and their presence seemed to keep the homeless men from pushing things further. I stayed quiet, watched the fire burn down, and eventually crawled into my tent, listening to the voices outside until I finally drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. I remember thinking, even in that moment, how different it would have been if I had been alone out there with only those two men. I pitied any other woman who might have run into them, with no one else around to add that layer of protection. That night made me realize how fragile safety could feel out on the trail, even when you thought you were surrounded by nature and freedom. On the Pacific Crest Trail, I had a completely different kind of scare. I was dropping down out of the mountains into a valley, moving along the dusty switchbacks, when I saw something over the ridge. At first it looked like huge black tendrils curling across the sky, like a giant hand reaching over the mountain. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. It was a dust storm, massive, spreading out across the landscape and moving fast toward me. The wind picked up before I could even decide what to do. Sand and dust whipped into my face, stinging my skin and filling my mouth. I knew I couldn't stay exposed. I ran down the trail, legs pounding, trying to find a spot with some cover where I could get my tent up before the storm swallowed me. My heart hammered as I scrambled into a little hollow between some low hills, the only bit of shelter I could see. I threw my pack down and worked as fast as I ever had in my life, yanking the poles into place, throwing the rainfly over, and piling big rocks onto the corners and edges. I barely got inside before the storm hit. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 freight trains tearing through the valley. The tent walls strained and shook, dust forcing its way through every tiny gap. I pressed my body flat, my pack shoved against one side, using my weight and the rocks to keep the whole thing from ripping free and flying into the night. For hours, the storm raged. The tent bent so far I thought it would collapse. The sand filled my nose, my hair, every corner of my gear. Couldn't sleep. I just lay there holding on, waiting for it to end. My throat was raw from breathing dust, my body sore from bracing against the shaking walls. By the time the storm died with the first light of dawn, I was amazed the tent was still standing at all. I crawled out and looked at it, streaked with dirt but still solid. It was a great tent, better than I could have hoped for in a night like that. Another time on the PCT, I got bitten by a brown recluse. The bite turned into a nasty wound, swollen and dark around the edges, the kind of thing that makes you nervous even if you've dealt with injuries before. I cleaned it, covered it, and kept an eye on it, but it lingered for weeks, an ugly mark that throbbed with every step. Add to that the burns I got later on, the most horrific sunburns of my life, skin peeling in layers and raw to the touch, and it felt like the trail was stripping me down piece by piece. But the thing is, even with nights like the one in Virginia, Even with the storm that nearly carried me away and the pain of the spider bite and the burns, I kept walking. The trail taught me to endure, to get through things I never thought I could. Each story is burned into me, not just because it was scary, but because I survived it. Looking back now, I don't see the trails as just miles of dirt winding through the country. They were long tests of patience, courage, and stubbornness. Some nights I was lucky, like when those soldiers happened to be there in Virginia. Some nights I had to depend on my own hands and my own grit, like when the storm closed in. And sometimes I just had to accept pain and keep moving forward, like with the bite and the burns. The end of it all was not one single finish line, but the sum of all those moments put together. They left me tougher, more aware of how small I am against the weight of nature and the danger of people, but also more certain of what I can get through. The trails gave me scars, but they also gave me proof that I could survive. That's the part that stays with me more than anything, the simple fact that I walked through it all and came out on the other side. I had been hiking alone for a few days in the south of Sweden. The weather had not been on my side that day. A damp mist hung in the trees and the light rain never seemed to stop. I had been walking for hours and the trail was quiet. Not many people were out that day because of the weather, and the silence made me feel like I was deeper in the wilderness than I really was. Late in the afternoon, I came across one of those wooden weather shelters they put up near the trail. It was a simple open structure, 3 walls and a roof with a dirt floor. In front of it was a picnic table and a fire pit that looked like it had been used recently. I was cold and tired, and even though I had planned to keep going a bit further, the idea of crawling into my sleeping bag under a roof sounded better than another few hours of rain. I set down my pack, unrolled my mat, and got my things arranged in the shelter. It was still light out, though gray and dim, so I made myself a simple meal, drank some water, and then lay down. The sound of the rain hitting the roof was steady, and I must have drifted in and out of sleep. When I woke again, it was already dark outside. The rain had stopped, but the clouds had moved on and the moon was out, almost full. It gave the clearing outside the shelter a pale glow, enough to see shapes and outlines clearly, but not enough to make me feel comfortable. I stayed still in my bag, my head resting on my bundle jacket. That was when I heard it, the sound of footsteps on the gravel trail. Slow, crunching steps moving closer to the shelter. I checked my watch. It was close to 11 at night. My first thought was that it must be another hiker caught out late, maybe looking for the same shelter. I pulled my bag a little closer to my face and opened my eyes just a bit, trying to look without being obvious. The footsteps came closer, and then I saw the figure. A man, his shape dark against the lighter gravel, moving with an unhurried pace. He got close enough to the shelter that I could see him more clearly. He was older, maybe late 50s or early 60s. He slowed down as he approached, and then stopped just a few feet from the opening. He looked into the shelter, and in that instant I knew he realized I was already inside. He stood there for a few seconds without saying a word. Then he turned, walked over to the picnic table, and sat down. I kept my eyes open just enough to watch him. That was when I noticed he wasn't wearing pants. From the waist down, he was completely naked, just sitting there in the open night air like it was nothing. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe he had gotten drunk. Maybe he was crazy. I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. I stayed still and quiet, pretending to be asleep. The man just sat there on the bench, facing the sea beyond the trees. He didn't move much. The whole thing was so bizarre I started to wonder if I was imagining it. But the longer I stared, the more real it became. I was exhausted from the long day, and eventually my body gave in to sleep. I don't know how long I slept before the next sound woke me. Again, footsteps on the gravel. This time faster, more deliberate. I blinked and then was blinded by a flashlight beam right in my eyes. I sat up quickly, disoriented, and saw 3 people standing there, 2 women and a man. They wore dark clothes with reflective patches like uniforms. They asked me questions, wanting to know who I was and what I was doing there. They seemed to be some sort of civil guard or local patrol. I explained that I was just hiking, had stopped at the shelter to rest, and was continuing in the morning. They seemed satisfied and moved on down the trail. When they left, I lay back down, but the comfort I'd felt earlier was gone. The shelter no longer felt safe. Still, my body was heavy with exhaustion, and somehow I drifted off again. An hour later, the sound returned. Gravel crunching under slow footsteps. My chest tightened, and I knew before I even looked that it was him again. I opened my eyes slightly, and there he was, the same older man, still without pants. He walked past the picnic table this time and moved around the shelter. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. I slid one hand slowly to the small can of deodorant I kept near the edge of my mat and the other to the tiny pocket knife I carried. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I kept still, barely breathing, watching him through the corner of my eye. He didn't come inside. Instead, he circled the shelter slowly, inspecting everything. He leaned close to the walls, looked at the fire pit, peered into the corners as if searching for something. The way he moved made it clear he wasn't just wandering by. He was interested in the shelter, in me. Then suddenly it went quiet. The footsteps stopped. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any sound. Nothing. No steps, no breathing, nothing. It was like he had vanished. I stayed frozen, every nerve in my body awake, listening to the silence. Minutes passed, though it felt much longer. I couldn't tell if he was still out there, watching, or if he had gone. The moonlight made everything outside the shelter glow faintly, but from where I was, the shadows were deep, and I couldn't see beyond them. I didn't dare move or make a sound. At some point, the stillness lulled me back towards sleep, though I never fully relaxed. I must have drifted in and out for the rest of the night, waking at every sound, imagining his figure stepping back into view. When the first light of dawn crept into the sky, a dull gray at first and then pink along the horizon, I didn't waste a second. I shoved my sleeping bag into my pack, stuffed everything inside without care, and hoisted it onto my shoulders. My hands were shaking as I tightened the straps. By the time the sun was visible above the trees, I was already moving fast down the trail, not looking back at the shelter even once. I don't know who that man was or what he was doing out there with no pants in the middle of the night. I don't know why he came back, why he circled the shelter, or why he disappeared so suddenly. What I do know is that I have never felt that kind of unease before. Being watched in the dark, with no one else around, just the sound of footsteps on gravel and the sight of a figure that didn't belong. By the time I reached a road later that morning and saw a car pass, I felt like I had stepped back into the normal world. But even now, when I think about that night, I can still hear those steps crunching closer and closer, and the image of him sitting bare on that bench stays with me. It was the kind of encounter that makes you realize how exposed you are out there, how easily something strange and wrong can cross paths with you, and how quickly your sense of safety can vanish. I kept hiking after that, but I never again spent the night in one of those shelters without thinking of that man.